according to St. Matthew, the 16th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. The Gospel of the Lord. So I have been to jail once, and once was enough. It was actually just this past Thursday. So before you get really concerned about what
I told her not to get caught.
before you get concerned about what I did or did not do, or start to wonder if you need to look for another associate pastor, I actually had an appointment to meet with the director and the deputy director of corrections. So I had asked to go to jail. Once I was escorted into the director's office, my surroundings wouldn't have given away that I was actually in jail, except for the fact that there was a large flat screen television with a live feed into the cell block. But walking into the jail, the anxiety that snuck up on me surprised me a little bit. I was, after all, not in trouble. I didn't really belong there. I was just visiting. However, there was no denying the vulnerability I felt as I tried to get my bearings. Especially as I checked in with the guard explaining who I was. From that vantage point, I could glance at the rows of phones hanging on the partitions, separating me from them, separating the visitors from the inmates. And there was a man seated at one of the phones talking to somebody on the other side who remains nameless and faceless to me. "Take a seat in the waiting room. Someone will be out to get you in a few minutes," the guard said to me as she announced to the person on the phone that I had actually arrived. In all honesty, there was absolutely nothing unusual about the waiting room. There were smooth black plastic chairs bolted to the ground and red accent tables, and an information kiosk which rolled information about programs offered in jails, about release protocols, and about contact information. It really wasn't unlike a doctor's office or the DMV or any other place that you would sit and wait for a while. But it felt a lot different. As an outsider to jail, it felt eerie. And so I reminded myself that this was just 1 hour of my life. You can survive anything for an hour, Christine, even hell. That's what I told myself. See, I had a little bit of an agenda when I set up my meeting at jail. I wanted to meet the man with the keys, the guy that had the power to lock up and to let go, to bind and to loose, to keep in and to keep out, the guy that stood between hell and heaven, or really in this case, hell and earth. It seemed to make sense to me in light of today's gospel. Peter is given the keys to the kingdom, and he's authorized to bind and loose. This is the text that gives us that secular image of Peter as the saintly gatekeeper, holding the keys to the pearly gates, letting some people into heaven and keeping some people out, relegating those to hell and granting divine admission tickets to some. So, hence my desire to talk to a jailkeeper. Now, I, like you, am aware that this is a fable that has been sort of etched onto Peter's story. Jesus wasn't saying, I have this shiny set of keys for you, Peter, and when you get to heaven, I'm going to give them to you. I'm pretty sure that Jesus was giving Peter the keys right then, at that very moment, as Peter stood on earth right before Jesus. I'm also pretty sure that this story has very little to do with the pearly gates, and everything to do with the gates of Hades. See, Jesus mentions heaven in the story, but he actually goes to hell. And you have to wonder why he goes to hell. See, the city of Caesarea Philippi, which is mentioned in the story, used to be called Penius, before Herod Philip renamed it after Caesar and himself. But regardless of what you want to call the city, regardless of what name it had then or has now, it had been the center for Pan worship. And Pan was the goat god. And it was believed that Pan lived nearby, right where they were, in a cave called, anybody know? The name of the cave where the Pan god lived. The gates of hell. The gates of Hades. Jesus could have given Peter the keys any place. He could have given them to him while he was on a fishing trip, or on his birthday, or some other time that made a lot more sense. But he took them to a place which involved orgiastic rituals with goats, a place which now teemed of political manipulation and cultic revelry, a place which frankly reeked of hell. This is the place that Jesus took the disciples. And this is where Jesus gives Peter the keys. And so, since I was sort of asking the infamous question, what would Jesus do, question to this text in relation to the keys, I thought that Jesus would say to me, well, Jesus wants you to go check out hell, which in my view was jail. So I thought, well, why argue with Jesus? Go to jail. So that's how I ended up there. And I was fairly clear on what my mission was. In my naive view, I figured the gates of hell Jesus wanted me to storm were behind those jail bars. I was fairly clear that those were the people that needed help. And I was fairly clear that heaven was on the outside of the jail, and hell was on the inside under lock and key. I know that I have mentioned this before, but it never ceases to amaze me that I'm very, very confident that Jesus has a really good sense of humor. Because, see, I did end up talking to the guy that held the keys, and I had my list of questions, right? I asked him about power and authority. I asked him about statistics and demographics. I asked him about violence and recidivism. And he patiently answered all of my questions. But when he got to choose what to talk about in relation to jail, he told me about the people. And while he was relaying one story to me, I kid you not, he handed me his phone so I could slide through his pictures. And they were pictures of him with the inmates, not unlike a grandmother at Bridge Club pulling out her photo album saying, "Here, check out my grandkids." There they stood with their arms across each other's shoulders and smiles painted across their faces, bound to one another. And he also spoke about the programs that they instituted for re-entry into society, into civilization. So immediately, right, since I came with my own agenda, immediately he starts talking about this, and I start thinking about hope. Did offering programs which were designed for re-entry symbolize hope to the inmates? Did that make them think that we wanted them to succeed? And he said, yeah, he thought they sort of read that subtext in those re-entry programs. But that finding a job, finding a place to live, finding family, those are not easy to accomplish on the outside. He said that they count down the months and the days and the minutes until they're released. And then they don't want to go. Because what they know is they're stepping out into another hell. As he continued to talk, I couldn't help but think that the main text was that they encountered just as much hell on the outside of the walls as on the inside. Jail certainly isn't, and it wasn't heaven for them. But it might have been a safe place. At one point in the conversation, the director looked at me, and knowing I was a pastor, he says, so often inmates, they attend religious services while they're in jail. And when they get out, they have a hard time finding a church where they're welcome. Once people find out they've been in jail, they find out very, very quickly that they really aren't welcome. And then he said, so where's your church? And I said, Gaithersburg. And I couldn't help but think, so who is holding the keys now? And it gives a whole new meaning to the circles of hell. I am sure that he felt like it was an innocuous statement. But what if jail also protects them from us? What if jail protects them from their very worst fear? That they aren't redeemable, that they aren't acceptable, and that they aren't lovable. Now that's not the case. God already accepts them and us, loves them and us, redeems them and us, however you want to define the us's and the them's of the world. But the truth remains that even when they have done their time in jail, even when the courts let them go, I am out here holding the keys. Now, I don't know if I would tell the director of corrections this or not, although I think he might know it, and I think he might have indirectly been telling it to me. But he actually has very, very little power. And before you think I'm going to say something bland, like, well, God has all the power. That's true, but it's way too easy, and it gets us off the hook. See, my friends, we have the power out here in this realm of the kingdom. God has given it to us. It's ironic because the way that I have always interpreted this passage is that God desires for us to be lucid, for us to all know forgiveness and grace, to know that freedom. And I do believe that everybody should know that freedom and deserves that. But for that kind of freedom to exist, to be realized, I think we have to be bound. Completely and utterly bound, hooked, connected, locked to every inmate in the jail and outside of the jail. To every single person, regardless of race or creed or gender or sexual orientation or status. See, what happens is events like the shooting and the riots in Ferguson, they heighten our awareness for a time. Just like my walking into jail, it heightens my awareness for that moment. Because they're stark reminders to us that we have a duty to others, to ask why, and then to be brave enough to follow where those questions may lead. But binding yourself to Ferguson is more than just liking a Facebook post. And it's more than trying to see the other side of the story from the law enforcement side. And it's more than saying I would riot. And it's more than saying I wouldn't riot. Those are part of the problem. It's binding ourselves to the black and the white. It's binding ourselves to the right and the wrong, the angry and the indifferent. We don't get to choose who we are bound to. At the foot of the cross, we are bound to every single person that Christ has ever redeemed or forgiven. And at the cross, Jesus declares, hell is empty, once and for all. Now, we may institute prison systems on earth, in Ferguson, in Israel, in Palestine, in Africa, and much more subtly in schools and communities and places of employment. Threads of violence and discrimination and hatred seek to weave their way into the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus says, here are the keys. Empty hell. I expect on that day, Peter didn't think he was going to be handed the keys to the kingdom as he stood there on that threshold between heaven and hell. Just as I expect you didn't think that you were going to be handed the keys to the kingdom this morning. But God did this crazy thing that he is so ought to do. God locked the keys to the kingdom inside the kingdom. And the keys aren't gold or silver